Hello everyone, Rumela here from the 1947 Partition Archive. I hope you had a great Wednesday. Today I am here to welcome you to the launch event series for the Tata Trust Partition Archive University Research Access Points, and I'm excited to be hosting this launch. We will be there every day this week at 8:30 p.m. Delhi time to tell you a bit about the project. So let me begin by introducing myself. My name is Rumela and I am Communications Manager of the Oral History Program at the 1947 Partition Archive. And today I am joining you from Kolkata, India. In case you are new to following us, the 1947 Partition Archive documents the nearly lost history of partition through our flagship Oral History project, which is the largest of its kind in South Asia. With your help, we have documented almost 10,000 family stories. You can learn more about our work by visiting our website or speaking to any of our team members. Visit our online channels to find all the links and content you need. Now, I would like to welcome our speaker for tonight, Vishwajeet. Hello, Vishwajeet.
Hello,
Vishwajeet,
hello, Romela.
hi. He is among the first cohort of grantees for the Tata Trust Partition Archive Research grants. Vishwajeet is a law student at Government Law College, Mumbai. He is currently a judicial intern with Justice G.S. Kulkarni at the Bombay High Court. He has worked with Dr. Euthan Charlton Stevens as a research assistant researching the history of Anglo Indians. Vishwajeet is also the multimedia director at Jurist Legal News and Commentary and has been awarded the Ginny Shawl Award for his work at Jurist. He serves on the editorial board of Bologna Law Review and Indian Constitutional Law Review Quarterly. He was a part of the Young Critics Lab cohort of 2020 at the Mumbai Academy of Moving Images Mumbai Film Festival and is trained as a film critic. He is a publisher of the Journal of Intersectional Analysis, established to increase the discussion on intersectionality in India. He runs Legal Access, a non-profit organization which provides legal advice to members from marginalized communities. Vishwajeet's articles have been published at the Times of Israel, the Eastern Herald, Jurist Legal News and Commentary Live Law, the Berkeley Journal of International Law, Bar and Bench Live History of India. Vishwajeet, we are so glad to have you for today's talk. Your work on Anglo Indian on the partition is really fascinating. So let us get started by you talking about it.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. I couldn't ask for a better one. Um, so, as Rumela has mentioned, that I am a law student, and that is where my interest for Anglo Indians actually started. It was in December of 2019 when the reservation, which is for Anglo Indian members in the Indian Parliament, was scrapped out. These were two seats in the Indian Parliament where the President of India would nominate two members of the Anglo Indian community to represent them. From that point onwards, I was very fascinated as to how this nomination was actually brought into picture. Because if many might know, India is a democracy with an elected government which is being brought ahead, but these two seats were nominated in itself. And subsequently, I started researching into why this particular nomination was removed. And to my fascination, it was seen that the Indian Parliament stated there are only about 300 members of the Anglo Indian community left in India, which is a gross calculation because there are millions. And even the O'Brien family have portrayed the numbers by the All India Anglo Indian Association. But what fascinated me is the history of this community, because as a student of law and the constitution, I used to go ahead and see, okay, two seats nominated for Anglo Indians, but I never really knew more about the community. And that is when I thought, okay, I must perhaps document the legal history of this community and how they got this particular nomination. And from that point onwards, I started researching more into this community. And to my surprise, it wasn't just a community who was left behind by the British, but it is perhaps a mixed race community which has developed in itself, that had found itself a nomination being represented by top notch leaders such as Sir Henry Gidney and Frank Anthony. Um, to, to move ahead, when I was doing my research, I came across the scholarship of my research supervisor for this project, Dr. Uther, who has written extensively on Anglo Indians, and I reached out to him with the very fact that how he has presented the census, which was taken by the British for such an minority, and how they developed the definition for the Anglo Indian community. Moving ahead with him, I got a very great opportunity to work alongside him and explore historical archives that were pre-partition and of colonial India, as to how this community was treated and how their numbers were dwindling and how many of them were actually even trying to pass as Europeans. To give you an example, it's a mixed race community. So in a family, you might have two brothers. One is a fairer one, and he's able to join the British Army just because he's fair and he's able to pass as an European, whereas the brother, who's a bit more darker, was not able to do so and was perhaps forced to choose another career which was not perhaps in the military itself. This fascinated me because it truly demonstrates that race is a construct in itself, and perhaps the research on the concept of critical race theory in India was perhaps lacking at a greater stage. Moving ahead, as I went ahead into it, I published papers which were in relation to the legal identity, that is, all the legislations of colonial India, which stated who Anglo Indians were, and perhaps the definition which was being taken by the British was again brought into the Indian constitution, which recognized that any member who had a patrilineal heritage of having a European would be considered an Anglo Indian. So this is how I was very fascinated with the history of Anglo Indians. And moving ahead, the turning point of this research came when India got its partition, because partition, as we know, was perhaps brought ahead as a Hindu Muslim debate, and the minorities per se were left with perhaps a choice whether to choose one or the other. And in this case, I was seeing that most of the Anglo Indians were perhaps forced to migrate to other Commonwealth countries in order to assimilate with those cultures, and those who stayed back either in India or either in Pakistan had to choose their loyalty to the state in that particular order. So that is when the migration of Anglo Indians started, which still continues in its different phases.
That's really fascinating. Thank you so much, Vishwajeet, for sharing that. So, I guess you have a presentation for tonight. Can we get the presentation?
Yes, sure. So, before I start, um, I would like everybody to know who exactly Anglo Indians were, because they are just being looked upon as a community who are perhaps Christians or being affiliated with a particular religion, but that's not the case. And through my work at the archive as well as otherwise, I also work on researching Jews who migrated from India upon India's partition. So these are the two minorities that I primarily deal with, that is the Anglo Indians and the Jews. So I would so who exactly were Anglo Indians? So we must understand that upon colonization, which started in the 17th century in India, several European powers had invaded India, French, Dutch, and the members of their army were actually being incentivized and even promoted to perhaps mate with native women of India in order to increase their population in India. And this is where I find the starting point of the Anglo Indians, which is in its precise terms, when someone has a European father and a native mother, those were the ones who were the mixed race Anglo Indians who were Christians at that very time. Uh, but again, we must not forget that communities develop, and upon such a development, Christopher Hawes, whose scholarship has argued that these Anglo Indians were perhaps described as poor relations of the British, because they did not really have top tier fathers and top tier army officers as their fathers. And in the late 19th century, a particular aspect of the Anglo Indian community which developed was that they started associating them within themselves, and it became a distinct community who were finding unions within the Anglo Indian communities, perhaps who were not established as well as the others, and it became a distinct community in itself. Further on, they went on to be associated with the Indian Railways because that is the time when the British were looking to award a position of power, and they weren't very trustful of the natives of India. Um, of course, for the Sepoy Mutiny, which happened, and they thought that Anglo Indians would be the ones who would be able to take this charge, primarily because they were able to speak the local languages, and in their view, they had the built and the rigor to survive in conditions which other Europeans could not. And this was a starting point where Anglo Indians were started, where Anglo Indians started getting positions which were in the railways and subsequently in educational institutions as teachers, because Anglo Indian women were very fluent when it came to um, English. This is a picture of an Anglo Indian family where you can see just the racial differences which were being brought ahead, and they're being documented through a vast variety of pictures and archives which exist. So as I mentioned before, is the primary reason for the employment of Anglo Indians in the railways was that they felt that these people could be brought ahead and be given positions of power in the railways. And as the railways started spreading across India, Anglo Indians were posted in those positions. Thus, you would find Anglo Indians not only limited to Calcutta or Madras, but you would also find them in the Pakistan areas, even in Baluchistan, and subsequently going Murree became a very popular spot in Pakistan where you would find Anglo Indians. And just with several establishments being brought ahead, they felt the need that new schools were to be established, and within these schools, Anglo Indian teachers were being recruited, and even natives were allowed in these schools at that very point in time. um, I would like to talk about this particular film which came out, which was based on a novel, which is called Bhuani Junction, and the novel is of the same name. Why I find this story very fascinating is because it is a story of an Anglo-Indian girl who is confused at the partition where to go, because she feels that India has become for Muslims. So where exactly should I stay back, or should I stay back in India, or should I start finding a home in other Commonwealth countries or in Britain? And this elaborated the anxiety which many Anglo Indians felt upon the partition, where they were not very sureful about their position once the British left. And in itself, they were worried about being a minority and not having representation in their own country at that very point in time. So, to elaborate what professions Anglo Indians existed in prior to um, the partition were, firstly, railways as railway drivers, and to put in perspective, it is like being a pilot in today's terms, because it is a position of power. You're given a lot of power, and the amount of allowances awarded to these railway drivers were also immense at that very point in time. Moving ahead, they also became doctors in several medical forces. The women took up positions in the military as nurses who were trying to wound soldiers from the World War II and World War II at that very point in time. And they joined a part of the auxiliary women's force. Several of them even went on to become school teachers. And subsequently, upon the efforts of Sir Henry Gidney, who was the leader of the All India Anglo Indian Association and the domiciled Europeans, several army positions were also opened to Anglo Indians, and thus they could serve in Air Force as well as other army positions which existed at that very point in time. To demonstrate how close Anglo Indians were with railways, this is a picture where you can see that a family has clicked this picture along the sides of the railway track with the family. It just establishes the amount of pleasure and amount of identity they were associated with when it came to railways, and they were even termed railway families to a greater extent. Um, you can also see that they also served in Queen Alexandra's military services. And one aspect that one might see is this services were only open to several European as well as Anglo Indian women, not because they were positions of power, but just that they could place some amount of trust, but not in an administrative position at that very time. In a community such as the Anglo Indians, several of them even established their own high schools. This is St. Michael's Anglo Indian School, which is in Kannur. And I was very fortunate enough to even find a particular interview um, where the student had studied at this institution and was describing the members who are in this very same picture, which I was able to locate through several archives. It's it's very fascinating to see how and why their employment was developed in this position was because of the ability of them to communicate in English and also pass it on to their children, but also to the natives who were trying to assimilate with the high class societies who could not afford sending their children to top British schools in England. They would send their children to Anglo Indian schools where they would be awarded great education. Um, in the next slide, you can see these are the two Anglo-Indian leaders that we see. It's the first one was Sir Henry Gidney, and his successor was Mr. Frank Anthony. And Frank Anthony had played a very key position when it came to the nominations, which I discussed in the beginning of my talk. Is um, when it came to the aspect of minorities and providing them with positions in the parliament itself, he negotiated with Sardar Patel to provide two seats for Anglo Indians, which were not nominated and um, which were not elected, but perhaps nominated, so that he could secure the future of his community, regardless of which government gets into power. Because in some ways, I find Frank Anthony very futuristic in his views, because in his autobiography, which is Britain's Betrayal in India, he had written that there will be a particular time when the government will try to forge our numbers and try to get these nominations off from us. It is so fascinating to see that he was very correct in that aspect. And um, just in December 2019, it proved to be right, because uh, the Indian Parliament and the minister who brought ahead said that there are only about 320 Anglo Indians left, and we do not need this reservation for those people. And it is a gross misrepresentation, because the numbers are far more. They're almost a million. And in my discussions with several Anglo Indian leaders and several members who in the parliament had protested against the same, had even provided data from the All India Anglo Indian Association. In some ways, Frank Anthony knew the view of minorities and how they are going to be perceived in the near future, because that their reservations and their positions were going to be endangered at some point in time. So now I would like to talk about how I was able to use the archive to my advantage and take into account so much of knowledge of Anglo Indians when there were very few interviews which actually existed of members who were from Anglo Indian communities. So first of all, I whatever the community members who identified themselves as Anglo Indians, I was very fortunate to see those interviews. I also saw the interviews of students who went to Anglo Indian schools, and these would include Bishop's Cotton School in Shimla, Cathedral School in Mumbai, Cathedral School in Karachi, and subsequently St. Anthony's at Lahore. So their interviews provided a very unique perspective of their teachers, because they would talk very highly of their teachers and even recall what Anglo Indian teachers imparted and how that impacted their lives in the future. Subsequently, even British Army members who had Anglo Indian colleagues, and of course, the main identifier of the Anglo Indian community, which is railway. So, the members who were working with the railway, I was able to look at their interviews and even understand what was going on at that very point in time. Not to forget that when the partition was happening, that is, the trains which were going from India to Pakistan and Pakistan to India, they were being drawn by Anglo Indian community members. And it is a very tough position to be in. And another community which was involved in the protection of the members who were in the trains were the Gurkhas. So the Anglo Indians and the Gurkhas were in such a difficult position because neither the Hindus nor the Muslims would actually attack them, because they knew that their people are coming from either of the sides, and thus they escaped a lot of the violence. But just to be in that position where you have to take the rail despite the amount of violences which are happening, because they realized that the moment they stop the train, it would mean a huge massacre despite it happening on them. So they wanted to ensure that people reached safely to either of the two countries. And even in Britain's betrayal, uh, Mr. Frank Anthony describes of a particular instance where, in a boarding school, which was Anglo Indian again, there were several Hindu students, and this particular boarding school was in Pakistan. And he wanted to ensure that there was a safe passage of these children, for the very fact that safety was of utmost importance at that very point of time of the children. And he had sent a special train with the youth wing of the All India Anglo Indian Association to go ahead and bring these children back. And subsequently, the same was ensured that no violence took place at these schools, um, even when even when the partition was happening. And several of the interviewees who talk about their times at these Anglo Indian institutes talk about a very secular time where they do not recall that there were differences between them on account of the religion, that whether they were Hindus or they were Jews or they were even Christians or Catholics or Muslims. There was no particular distinction or discrimination, perhaps might be the correct word of use, that was brought ahead, and that at that very particular institute, thus imbibing a sense of unity among the students was of a great importance of these Anglo-Indian institutes. Having been studied from that, I totally support at the same notion that Anglo-Indians would bring ahead. And of course, the myriad aspect of Anglo-Indian exodus that I would like to talk about is, upon partition, several of the Anglo-Indian members were left in awe that whether whether they would be able to survive in a secular India or even Pakistan. Eventually, many of the members from India moved to Pakistan in order to ensure that they were able to get higher positions, which were being vacated by the Hindu and Sikh officers of what today stands as Pakistan and what before stood as the British India. Hence, in order to attain a better um, position and better future, a few of them went from India to Pakistan to get these positions. And the wealthy Anglo Indians who were able to manage uh, to go ahead and move to Commonwealth countries managed to do so by going to England and Canada, and subsequently around 1960s, when the policies of the nations like Australia and New Zealand were open, several of the Anglo Indians moved to those countries in order to assimilate with their own kind, as they might say. So what exactly do these narratives, when viewed from such a very minute perspective of even others, reveal is that they provide a insight into another person's life. It could even be a teacher. And several of these interviewees mentioned that upon independence, they did notice that there was a cultural shift, because several of the Anglo Indian teachers were actually forced to leave. Um, they were forced to leave India, and they were forced to leave Pakistan or move to either of the state or move to a Commonwealth country. And they described that, even so many members described that the turmoil faced by the community, and how some members of the community felt that they had no other option than to immigrate to one of the Commonwealth countries. And the previous scholarship in this aspect confirms that the assertion from the migrants who migrated, but not from, but what this scholarship provides is a perspective from non-immigrants. It provides a perspective of Hindus and Muslims and their views of Anglo Indians and how they perceived them. So this is what I have been trying to do while being a non-Anglo Indian, trying to write about Anglo Indians, and also assessing the interviews of several non-Anglo Indians who were associated either through school or through railways, and ascertaining their position in the British India and subsequently the post-colonial India. So this is a picture of the um, Bishop Cotton School, which is at Shimla, and again an Anglo-Indian institution with which has provided a great amount of alumni. There's also St. Anthony's at Lahore. Um, then there is Cathedral and John School, which is at Mumbai. Now, I would like to touch upon the aspect of the Jews in Pakistan. Um, since you mentioned in my biography that I've written in Times of Israel, my earlier research focused on Jews in colonial India, and to look at cinematic history because several of the early Indian actresses were actually Jewish, in fact. And they changed their names to perhaps get ahead in this particular industry. And several of the actresses were even Anglo Indians. To one's surprise, the first Miss India of independent India was actually a Jewish lady. And uh, this history of Jews in Pakistan dates back at least as far as 1839. And various estimates have suggested that about 1,000 Jews to 2,500 Jews living in Karachi at the beginning of the 20th century, most of them being Bene Israel Jews from Maharashtra, which is in India today. The Bene Israel Jews from Maharashtra were concentrated in Karachi. To give a broader perspective, before the partition, the Bombay province itself was huge, which had both the Karachi, Gujarat, which stands today, along with the Maharashtra, which stands today. So they had moved to Karachi because that was a seaport city which had helped them to get several employment opportunities being Jews at that very point in time. And leading up to the time of partition, only some 1,300 Jews remained in Karachi. Most of them were Bnei Israel Jews observing Sephardic Jewish rites. And the real exodus of Jews from British India to Bombay and then perhaps to the several cities in India came just prior to the creation of Israel. To give a more broader perspective, just when India got partition, several of these Jews realized that Pakistan is not going to be a nation which is going to save them from the persecution. And since most of them were concentrated in Karachi, they were able to take ships from Karachi to Bombay, and they came to Bombay right after the partition, or subsequently a year or two later, since the violence was not spread to the Jews at that very point in time. And several of these Jews found solace being in Bombay because there were several schools, which is the Ali Kaduri School and David Sassoon Institution, which provided Jews with some amount of assistance to find a better life again. And leading up to that, when the creation of Israel came back, most of them chose to leave India and go to Israel to establish a home for themselves for a land which would be which they thought would be for the Jewish populace for the great amount of time. Um, the archives had provided stories of Jewish migrants as well who had been to Israel, and those stories have been very fascinating because they talk about a culture, a Jewish culture in Pakistan and Karachi, which today has just died from the very effect of a partition which happened. And sometimes it is observed that the violence or the impact was only observed onto Hindus or Muslims, but often they forget that even deaths of cultures, such as the Jewish culture, was a subsequent consequence of this partition. And even the Anglo Indian lives were being impacted severely because they had to choose between the two nations and even choose to go abroad and go live in a Commonwealth country, which they wouldn't have done if the partition had not existed and a secular independent India had been established at that very point in time. This is a picture of the Jews in Karachi, which was taken at a wedding. And it only fascinates me that the number of Jews in this picture, and one might be very fascinated that several of these Jews even spoke Marathi while being in Karachi, and their culture was so unique because it wasn't a culture which was purely Jewish or what is being observed today in Israel, but perhaps something which only Indian Jews could have offered. And I look at it sort of as the death of a culture which happened, which could have been easily protected at that very point in time. And um, to come to an end of my presentation, how does this what impact does this research have? This is a question which I've been asking myself, and the only thing which I could understand from this very aspect is that these narratives need to be told, because even in a world, even in the concept of partition, which is dominated by the Hindus and Muslims, these minorities, which is Anglo Indians and Jews, need to be heard, need to be told. And these narratives that shed light on the struggles of minorities and extend the fragment of impact of partition in a new route, because the Anglo Indians found themselves compelled to find a refuge in Commonwealth nations, whereas most of the Jewish people chose to find a safe haven in Israel, and some of them even in India. Additionally, a major contribution which is highlighted, or perhaps which has impacted India and is India, which is independent India, and Pakistan as well, has been the contribution of Anglo Indian community by their teachers and several of the non-Anglo Indian professionals, non-Anglo Indian interviewees talking about how their lives were being impacted by these minorities and by the teachers of these minorities is just fascinating to me. Um, Currently, even in India, we're going through a very difficult time. It's nothing less than a tragedy, just the amount of lives that this virus has taken. And this one quote, which has stuck very close to me, that let everything happen to you, beauty and terror, just keep going, no feeling is final. And the narratives which I heard while at my time, while being a grantee of the 1947 Partition Archive, have only given me so much hope, because despite so many struggles, despite having such good and bad days, if I might say, they kept going, and they realized that the feeling was never final, because they found their happiness in one way or another. And this has been what I've taken from the archive, and this is what my research keeps keeps looks forward to putting ahead, is no feeling is final, and just to learn that how these communities had to struggle, not only on the basis of their identity, but just their existence or their race. And that motivates me, and that is what I seek to do through my research.
Thank you so much, Vishwajeet, for that fantastic presentation. It was really informative, and we are really glad to hear that accessing the archive has actually helped you to move your research forward. So, if we have any questions, we will be taking questions. We would request our viewers to type the questions in your comment boxes. Meanwhile, we would thank everyone for tuning in today, and thank you so much, Vishwajeet, for your time. If you love our oral history work and our mission, please consider making a donation of any size. We rely 100% on donations as an NGO. In some countries, donations are tax free, and we have the links in the description to this video. So we have some comments. Thank you so much, Vishwajeet. Indeed, your presentation and your talk was very interesting and intriguing at the same time. And we wish you good luck for your research ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Indeed, a pleasure to be here. Thank you so much.
Good night. Bye bye.
Yeah, have a nice evening.